The blood on Olivia Jensen's hands had long since dried by the time she stumbled out of the sodden tent at the edge of Colfax, California. But the exhaustion weighing down her bones felt permanent, as the Sierra Nevada mountains rising in the distance. It was March of 1882, and spring rains had turned the mining camp into a maze of mud and desperation. Yet another child had entered this harsh world under her care, and the mother, a pale woman named Sarah, whose husband had died in a cave 2 months prior, had nothing to offer but tears of gratitude. Olivia had waved away the apology, packed her bag with hands that trembled from 16 hours of labor, and walked back toward town as dawn broke cold and gray over the foothills. She was 24 years old and had been delivering babies since she was 19, learning first from her own mother back in Sacramento, before cholera had taken both her parents within a week of each other. Colfax was a railroad town, perched along the Central Pacific Line where the mountains began their steep climb toward the summit, and it drew all manner of people seeking fortune or fleeing misfortune. The legitimate businesses clustered around the depot, while the mining camps and logging operations sprawled into the surrounding forest like mushrooms after rain. Olivia had made it her business to go wherever she was needed, whether that meant climbing to a cabin 3 miles up a muddy trail or delivering twins in the back room of a Chinese laundry. The problem was that half the people who needed her could not pay, and Olivia had never learned how to say no to a woman in labor just because her pockets were empty. Her own rent was 2 months overdue, her landlady, Mrs. Henderson, had begun leaving pointed notes under her door, and when she stopped by Patterson's general store that morning to buy coffee and beans, the store owner's wife had pulled her aside with an uncomfortable expression. "Miss Jensen," Martha Patterson had said, her plump face creasing with concern, "your account has gotten rather high. I hate to mention it, but Mr. Patterson says we cannot extend any more credit until you settle at least half of what is owed." Olivia had felt her stomach drop. She knew the number without asking, $47.30, a sum that might as well have been $400 for all the chance she had of paying it. "I understand," she had said quietly, setting down the coffee she had been about to purchase. "I will work something out." She had left the store with nothing but her medical bag and her pride, both feeling considerably heavier than they had that morning. The sun had finally broken through the clouds, but it did nothing to warm the chill that had settled into her chest. She could sell some of her instruments, perhaps, though the thought made her throat tight. Every piece of equipment had been carefully chosen, saved for, treasured. The forceps had belonged to her mother. The scalpel had been a gift from Dr. Winters in Sacramento, who had taught her the difference between confident hands and reckless ones. Olivia was so lost in her thoughts that she nearly collided with a man leading a horse down the muddy main street. She stepped back quickly, her boots squelching in the mud, and found herself looking up at someone she had seen around town but never properly met. He was tall, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water over stones, gray-green and watchful. He wore the dusty clothes of someone who worked with cattle, denim pants and a worn leather vest over a dark shirt, and there was a gentleness in the way he steadied his horse that made something in Olivia's chest tighten unexpectedly. "Pardon me, miss," he said, his voice low and rough like creek gravel. "Did not see you there." "My fault entirely," Olivia replied, stepping further aside. "I was not watching where I was going." He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that seemed old-fashioned even in 1882, and continued past her. She watched him go for a moment, noting the way he moved with an easy confidence that suggested strength without arrogance, then shook herself and continued toward her small rented room above the seamstress shop. She had more pressing concerns than noticing cowboys, no matter how kind their eyes might be. What Olivia did not see was the man, whose name was Kenneth Yates, and who had been working as a ranch hand and occasional cattle driver for the past 6 years, pause at the door of Patterson's general store and go inside. She did not see him approach the counter where Martha Patterson was reorganizing a display of canned goods, or hear him speak in that same low, rough voice. "Mrs. Patterson, I could not help but overhear your conversation with Miss Jensen earlier, the midwife." Martha turned, her expression guarded. Kenneth Yates had always been respectful and prompt with his payments, but this was unusual. "Yes. What does she owe?" Kenneth asked directly. Martha hesitated, clearly uncertain about the propriety of sharing such information, but something in Kenneth's steady gaze made her answer. $47.30. But Mr. Yates, I really should not be discussing another customer's affairs. Kenneth reached into his pocket and counted out $50 in bills and coins, placing them on the counter with deliberate care. "This covers her debt and gives her a little credit besides. I would appreciate it if you did not mention where the payment came from. Just tell her an anonymous benefactor settled her account." Martha stared at the money, then at Kenneth, her eyes widening. "Mr. Yates, that is extraordinarily generous. Are you certain?" "I am certain," Kenneth said. "Miss Jensen does good work in this town. Delivered my sister's baby last year when we thought she might lose it. Would not take a penny, even though my brother-in-law tried to insist. Some debts cannot be repaid directly." He left before Martha could say anything else, leading his horse toward the livery stable where he boarded it between jobs. The truth was a little more complicated than he had let on. Yes, Olivia had delivered his sister Clara's baby, a difficult breech birth that had required skill and steady nerves. And yes, she had refused payment despite Clara and her husband John being able to afford it. But that was not the only reason Kenneth found himself thinking about the midwife with increasing frequency. He had first noticed her about 8 months ago, emerging from a cabin up in the hills where a logger's wife had been in labor for nearly 2 days. Kenneth had been riding past, checking fence lines for the ranch that employed him, and he had seen Olivia walking down the trail with her bag in one hand and the other pressed to the small of her back, her face drawn with exhaustion but somehow still beautiful in the late afternoon light. She had looked up as he passed, and their eyes had met for just a moment, and something in Kenneth's chest had shifted like a rock slide, sudden and irrevocable. Since then, he had made it his business to learn what he could about her without being obvious. She was unmarried, which seemed impossible given her kindness and intelligence, and the way her dark hair caught red highlights in the sun. She had no family in Colfax, having come from Sacramento 5 years ago. She lived simply, spending almost nothing on herself, and she never turned away anyone who needed her help regardless of their ability to pay. Kenneth, who had grown up poor himself, the son of a failed farmer who had drunk himself to death when Kenneth was 15, understood both the impulse and the consequences. He was 28 now, old enough to know that feelings like the ones he had for Olivia Jensen were rare and valuable and terrifying. He was also practical enough to know that a ranch hand with seasonal work and $30 to his name was not exactly a prize catch, even in a rough town like Colfax where unmarried women were scarce. So he had kept his distance, watched from afar, and told himself he was content to simply ensure she did not suffer for her generosity. Paying her store account was a significant chunk of his savings, money he had been setting aside for the past 3 years with a vague plan of buying his own land someday. But when he had seen her face in the store that morning, the careful blankness that meant she was hiding shame and worry. The decision had been easy. He could save again. She needed help now. 3 days later, Olivia returned to Patterson's general store with her rent money, scraped together by selling a pair of silver hair combs that had belonged to her grandmother. She intended to buy only the barest essentials, coffee and flour and perhaps some salt pork if she could afford it, enough to keep her going until she received payment from one of her wealthier clients. She was preparing her apology for not being able to pay anything toward her debt when Martha Patterson greeted her with a smile that seemed unusually warm. "Miss Jensen, how lovely to see you. What can I get for you today?" "Just a few things," Olivia said cautiously, setting her basket on the counter. "And I wanted to discuss my account. I have $3 I can pay toward it today, and I should be able to give you more in another week when Mrs. Morrison settles her bill." Martha waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, there is no need for that. Your account was settled several days ago." Olivia felt the room tilt slightly. "I beg your pardon. Your debt was paid in full," Martha repeated, clearly pleased to deliver good news. "An anonymous benefactor took care of it. You actually have a small credit now, about $2.70. "But that is impossible," Olivia said faintly. "Who would do such a thing?" "I am not at liberty to say," Martha replied, though her eyes sparkled with a secret. "I was asked specifically not to reveal the identity." "But you have a friend in this town, Miss Jensen, someone who values your work and wanted to help." Olivia stood frozen, her mind racing through possibilities. Mrs. Morrison, perhaps, though the banker's wife had never shown particular warmth toward her. Dr. Winters from Sacramento might have heard of her troubles, though how he would have known about her specific debt seemed unlikely. The Chinese families whose children she had delivered often tried to pay her in other ways, food or mended clothes, but $47 was far beyond their means. "I do not understand," she said finally. "I cannot accept such charity. It is not right." "It is not charity, it is gratitude," Martha said firmly. "You have helped half this town at one time or another, Miss Jensen. Someone simply wanted to return the favor." "Now, what would you like to purchase today?" Still dazed, Olivia bought her supplies, adding a few items she had been doing without for months: a bar of proper soap, some tea, a tin of peaches. When she left the store, the weight of the basket in her arms felt both comforting and strange, as if she had been given a gift she had not earned. She spent the walk back to her room trying to puzzle out the identity of her mysterious benefactor, running through everyone she had helped in the past year, but no answer seemed to fit. Kenneth, watching from across the street where he was loading supplies for the ranch, allowed himself a small smile. Martha had kept her word about anonymity, which was exactly what he had wanted. He did not need or want Olivia's gratitude. He just needed her to be able to keep doing her work without slowly starving herself in the process. Over the following weeks, spring deepened into early summer, and Colfax grew busier as the mountain passes cleared and logging operations resumed in full force. Olivia found herself constantly in demand, delivering babies and treating injuries, and occasionally sitting with the dying when their families needed someone with steady hands and a calm presence. She tried to be more practical about accepting payment, but she still could not bring herself to demand money from families who clearly had none to spare. What she did not know was that Kenneth had started a pattern of quietly settling her store account whenever it crept above $20. He did it carefully, spacing out the payments so it would not seem obvious, always insisting on anonymity. And Martha Patterson kept his secret because she thought it was the most romantic thing she had witnessed in her 15 years of marriage to a practical, unimaginative storekeeper. Kenneth also began finding excuses to be in town more often. taking odd jobs that kept him near the main street where he might catch a glimpse of Olivia coming or going. He mended fences for the widow Thompson, whose property adjoined the edge of town. He helped repair the roof of the schoolhouse after a storm tore off several shingles. He spent more time at the saloon than was strictly wise, nursing a single beer through an entire evening, just because the saloon's windows offered a view of the seamstress shop where Olivia lived. His friend Marcus, another ranch hand who had worked alongside Kenneth for the past 4 years, finally confronted him on a warm evening in early June. They were sitting on the porch of the bunkhouse, watching the sun set behind the mountains and creating that particular quality of light that made everything seem both sharp and soft at the same time. "You are going to have to actually talk to her eventually," Marcus said without preamble. Kenneth, who had been lost in thoughts of dark hair and capable hands, startled slightly. "Talk to who?" "The midwife, Miss Jensen. Do not pretend you do not know what I mean. You have been mooning over her for months now." "I do not moon," Kenneth said with dignity. "You absolutely moon," Marcus replied cheerfully. He was younger than Kenneth by 3 years, with an easy smile and the kind of uncomplicated confidence that Kenneth had never managed to cultivate. "It is actually painful to watch. Just go introduce yourself properly. Ask if you can walk her home from a call sometime. Something." "She is educated and skilled and respected," Kenneth said quietly. "I am a ranch hand who can barely write my own name. What exactly am I supposed to offer someone like that?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, his expression turning serious. "Kenneth, you are the best man I know. You are honest and hardworking and kinder than anyone gives you credit for. Any woman would be lucky to have you, including a pretty midwife who works herself half to death taking care of other people." "She does not even know I exist," Kenneth said. "Then make her know," Marcus replied. "Otherwise you are going to spend the rest of your life watching her from across the street and paying her bills in secret, and that is no kind of life for either of you." Kenneth knew his friend was right, but knowing and acting were different things entirely. He had been poor all his life, had learned early that wanting things was often just an invitation to disappointment. Better to be content with what you had, to find satisfaction in work well done and simple pleasures, than to reach for something beautiful and watch it slip through your fingers. But that night, lying in his narrow bunk and listening to the sounds of the other ranch hands snoring and shifting in their sleep, Kenneth let himself imagine what it might be like to actually court Olivia Jensen. To walk beside her in the evening light, to hear her laugh at something he said, to be the person she turned to when she was tired or worried or simply in need of someone who understood. The images were sweet enough to make his chest ache, and dangerous enough that he forced himself to think about something else, anything else, until sleep finally took him. The opportunity came sooner than he expected, though not in any way he might have anticipated. It was a Saturday in mid-June, the kind of day when the heat settled into the valley like a physical presence, and even the shade offered only marginal relief. Kenneth had ridden into town to pick up supplies and was walking past the saloon when he heard raised voices coming from inside. That in itself was not unusual. The saloon saw its share of arguments and the occasional fistfight, but something about the tone made him pause. He pushed through the swinging doors and immediately saw the problem. A man he recognized as Tom Gardner, a logger with a reputation for mean drunkenness, was standing too close to Olivia Jensen, who had clearly been summoned to help with some medical issue, and was now trapped between Gardner and the bar. Her bag was on the floor at her feet, and her face was calm but pale, the expression of someone trying very hard not to show fear. "I said you owe me," Gardner was saying, his words slurred but his anger clear. "You came to my camp last winter, took care of my woman, and I paid you good money. Then she died anyway, and I want my money back. Mr. Gardner, Olivia said with careful patience, your wife was already gravely ill when I arrived. I did everything I could, but sometimes illness progresses beyond what medicine can treat. I cannot refund money for services rendered in good faith. Services, Gardner spat. You let her die, and you took my money, and now you are going to give it back, or I am going to take it out of your hide. Kenneth was moving before he made a conscious decision, crossing the saloon in 4 long strides and placing himself between Gardner and Olivia. That is enough, he said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made several other patrons turn to watch. The lady has done nothing wrong. You need to leave her alone. Gardner was a big man, thick through the shoulders and used to intimidating people through sheer size. But Kenneth was taller and carried himself with the kind of stillness that suggested he knew exactly what to do with his fists if necessary. They stared at each other for a long moment while the saloon held its breath. This is none of your business, Yates, Gardner finally said, but he took a step back. I am making it my business, Kenneth replied. Miss Jensen provides a valuable service to this community, and you will treat her with respect. Your wife's death was a tragedy, but it was not Miss Jensen's fault, and you know it. Something flickered in Gardner's eyes, grief maybe, or shame, or just the stubborn anger of a man who needed someone to blame for his pain. For a moment, Kenneth thought it might come to blows anyway, and he shifted his weight slightly, prepared. But then the bartender, a grizzled former boxer named Sullivan, leaned across the bar and said, Tom, you have had enough. Go sleep it off. The fight went out of Gardner all at once. He looked at Kenneth, then at Olivia, then turned and stumbled out of the saloon into the brutal afternoon heat. The other patrons gradually returned to their drinks and conversations, and Kenneth became suddenly, acutely aware that Olivia was standing right behind him, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent of her soap. He turned carefully and found her looking up at him with an expression he could not quite read. Relief, certainly, but something else too, a curiosity that had not been there before. Thank you, she said. That could have become very unpleasant. Are you all right? Kenneth asked. His heart was still pounding, though whether from the confrontation or from her proximity he could not say. I am fine, Olivia assured him. She bent to pick up her bag, and Kenneth moved to help her, their hands brushing briefly as they both reached for the handle. The contact sent a jolt through him that was entirely out of proportion to the brief touch. I was called here to stitch up a cut for one of the dealers, but I think perhaps I should leave before Mr. Gardner decides to come back. Let me walk you home, Kenneth said, the words emerging before he could second-guess them. Just to be safe. Olivia studied him for a moment, and Kenneth had the uncomfortable feeling of being assessed and catalogued, as if she could see right through to all his secrets and inadequacies. But then she smiled, a real smile that transformed her tired face into something luminous, and said, I would appreciate that, Mr. Yates. The fact that she knew his name struck him momentarily speechless. He had not realized she was aware of his existence beyond their brief collision on the street months ago. He managed to recover enough to offer his arm, which she took, and they walked out of the saloon together into the pressing heat of the afternoon. For the first few minutes they walked in silence, Olivia's hand resting lightly in the crook of Kenneth's elbow, both of them acutely aware of the curious glances from other townspeople. Colfax was small enough that any new pairing was immediate gossip, and Kenneth could practically feel the speculation rippling out around them like rings in water. I should properly introduce myself, Kenneth said finally. Kenneth Yates. I work as a ranch hand mostly, some cattle driving when the season calls for it. Olivia Jensen, she replied, though of course he already knew that. midwife and general medical nuisance to people who prefer their ailments untreated. Kenneth laughed, surprised. He had not expected her to be funny. Is that how you see yourself? It is how some people see me, Olivia said. Women, especially in these parts, are not supposed to be too educated or too confident or too insistent on proper medical care. I have stepped on numerous toes simply by knowing more than husbands think I should. Their loss, Kenneth said. You delivered my sister's baby last year, Clara Yates, married to John Brennan. She says you saved both their lives. Olivia's expression softened. I remember Clara. That was a complicated birth. How are she and the baby doing? Thriving, both of them. Young Thomas is walking now and getting into everything. Clara wanted to pay you, but you refused. She had already lost 2 babies, Olivia said quietly. When I left that cabin and both she and Thomas were alive and healthy, that felt like payment enough. Money is useful, certainly, but it is not why I do this work. They had reached the seamstress shop, and Olivia paused at the external staircase that led up to her room. She turned to face Kenneth, withdrawing her hand from his arm, and he felt the loss of contact like a physical ache. Thank you again for your help in the saloon, she said. I have dealt with angry family members before, but Mr. Gardner was particularly intimidating. It was kind of you to intervene. It was nothing, Kenneth said, though they both knew it was more than nothing. Miss Jensen, I wonder if I might call on you sometime. Properly, I mean, if that would be acceptable. Olivia's eyes widened slightly, and a faint color rose in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the heat. You want to court me? Yes, Kenneth said simply. There was no point in pretending otherwise, not when his intentions had to be clear as mountain water by now. If you are amenable. I know I am just a ranch hand and you are educated and respected, but I think highly of you. Have for some time, if I am being honest. For a long moment, Olivia simply looked at him, and Kenneth braced himself for gentle rejection. But then she said, I would like that. I am often called away at odd hours, so I cannot promise to always be available, but yes, you may call on me, Mr. Yates. The smile that spread across Kenneth's face felt like it might crack something open in his chest. Kenneth, please, and I understand about your work. I would never ask you to neglect your patients. Then perhaps you should call me Olivia, she said, and there was something almost shy in the way she said it, as if she was not used to this kind of personal interaction. Would you like to come to dinner tomorrow evening? Nothing fancy. I am afraid my cooking skills are entirely adequate and never better than that, but we could talk properly. I would like that very much, Kenneth said. They stood there for another moment, neither quite ready to end the conversation, until finally Olivia laughed and said, I should go. I have 3 visits to make this afternoon, and I am already behind schedule. Kenneth watched her climb the stairs and disappear into her room, feeling like something fundamental had shifted in his world. Marcus was going to be insufferable when he heard about this, but Kenneth found he did not care. He walked back to where he had left his horse with a lightness in his step that had nothing to do with the oppressive heat, and everything to do with the memory of dark eyes and a shy smile. True to his word, Kenneth appeared at Olivia's door the following evening carrying a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked from the meadow near the ranch. They were simple, black-eyed Susans and purple lupines and delicate white flowers whose name he did not know, but Olivia's face lit up when she saw them as if he had brought her roses from some fancy shop. They are beautiful, she said, taking them with genuine pleasure. Come in, please. I hope you do not mind eating in my room. I do not have anywhere else to entertain. Kenneth entered the small space and was immediately struck by how much it revealed about her. The room was barely large enough for a narrow bed, a small table with 2 chairs, and a cabinet for her belongings, but she had made it comfortable in small ways. Curtains in a cheerful yellow print softened the window. Books were stacked carefully on every available surface, medical texts mixed with poetry and novels. A quilt in a wedding ring pattern covered the bed, the stitching so fine, and even that Kenneth suspected it had been made by someone who loved her. "My mother made that," Olivia said, noticing his gaze. "It is one of the few things I have left of her." "It is beautiful," Kenneth said. "You must miss her." "Every day," Olivia replied quietly. She busied herself putting the wildflowers in a mason jar filled with water, then gestured to the table. "Please sit. I made chicken and dumplings. I hope that is all right." "It smells wonderful," Kenneth said honestly. The small room was filled with the savory scent of herbs and simmering meat, and he realized he was genuinely hungry in a way that went beyond simple appetite. He was hungry for this, for domestic comfort and simple conversation, and the company of someone who made his pulse quicken just by existing in the same space. They ate, and they talked, and Kenneth discovered that Olivia was even more remarkable than he had imagined. She was well-read despite her limited formal education. Having devoured every medical text she could find and taught herself anatomy and pharmacology through sheer determination. She had opinions on everything from women's suffrage to the proper treatment of childhood fevers, and she listened with genuine interest when Kenneth talked about his own life, the years of drifting work after his father died, the gradual realization that he was good with animals and even better at the kind of steady, reliable labor that ranching required. "Do you ever want to have your own place?" Olivia asked, refilling his coffee cup from the pot she had kept warm on her small stove. "I have been saving toward it," Kenneth admitted. "Land is expensive and I do not have much, but eventually I would like a small ranch of my own. Nothing grand, just enough to run some cattle and maybe grow hay, be my own man." "That sounds wonderful," Olivia said. "I think you would be good at it. You have that quality of someone who takes care of what is his." Kenneth felt warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "What about you? Do you want to stay in Colfax forever?" Olivia was quiet for a moment, her hands wrapped around her own cup, her gaze distant. "I do not know," she said finally. "I came here because Sacramento had too many memories after my parents died, and I heard that mining and railroad towns needed midwives. I have made a life here, and I value the work I do, but sometimes I wonder what it would be like to have more. A real practice, perhaps, or a hospital where I could work alongside other medical professionals. But those are just dreams. The reality is that I am needed here, and that matters more than my own ambitions." "Why can your ambitions not matter too?" Kenneth asked gently. Olivia met his eyes and something passed between them, an understanding that neither had quite expected. "I suppose they could," she said softly. "I am not used to thinking about what I want rather than what I should do." "Maybe it is time to start," Kenneth suggested. They talked until the sun set, and the room grew dim, and Kenneth lit the lamp on the table without thinking, the gesture so natural and domestic that it made Olivia's breath catch. When he finally left, well past the time when respectable visiting hours should have ended, he took her hand and held it gently, his calloused fingers careful against her skin. "May I see you again?" he asked, though the answer was written in her eyes. "Yes," Olivia said. "Yes, please." Over the following weeks, Kenneth and Olivia fell into a pattern of stolen moments and careful courtship. He would appear at her door in the evenings when his work was done, often bringing small gifts that revealed how closely he was paying attention to her life. A new medical text that she had mentioned wanting, fresh eggs from the ranch, a shawl he had bought from a traveling merchant because the nights were getting cooler as summer progressed. Olivia, for her part, began to watch for him, listening for his distinctive knock, and she found herself telling him things she had not shared with anyone else. Her fears that she was not skilled enough for the work she did, her grief for her parents, her loneliness in a town where she was needed but not quite accepted. Martha Patterson at the general store watched this developing romance with great satisfaction and continued to keep Kenneth's secret about the store payments. Olivia's account would creep up and then mysteriously be paid down again, and Olivia had stopped asking questions because she did not want to know if her anonymous benefactor might eventually want something in return. She told Kenneth about the mysterious payments one evening, her voice troubled. "I feel like I am accepting charity under false pretenses," she said. They were sitting on the steps outside her room, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Someone keeps paying my store account, and I cannot determine who or why, and it makes me uneasy. What if they expect something from me that I cannot give?" Kenneth, who had paid down $23 just that morning, felt guilt twist in his stomach. He had never intended for the payments to distress her, only to help. "Maybe they do not want anything except to know that you can continue your work without worrying about money," he said carefully. "Some people like to help without recognition." "That would be extraordinarily generous," Olivia said doubtfully. "You are extraordinarily generous yourself," Kenneth pointed out. "Perhaps someone simply wants to return the favor." Olivia leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture that still felt new enough to make Kenneth's heart race. "I suppose. I just wish I could thank them properly." Kenneth wrapped his arm around her, holding her close, and said nothing. He could tell her the truth, but he suspected she would be embarrassed or feel obligated, and he wanted neither of those things. He just wanted her to be able to do her work and not have to choose between feeding herself and helping others. In late July, a crisis brought their relationship into sharper focus. A fire broke out in one of the logging camps up in the hills, the result of a cooking accident that spread rapidly through the dry summer forest. By the time the flames were contained, 3 men were dead and 8 others were badly burned. Olivia was summoned to the camp and spent 4 days there, barely sleeping, treating burns and watching for infection, and trying to save lives with inadequate supplies and no backup. Kenneth rode up to the camp on the 2nd day, bringing additional medical supplies he had purchased in town and simply refusing to leave. He helped hold down patients while Olivia debrided burned flesh. He boiled water and changed bandages, and sat with dying men so they would not be alone when the end came. He watched Olivia work herself to the point of collapse, and when she finally allowed herself to rest, he carried her to a quiet spot away from the camp and held her while she cried for the men she could not save. "I should have been able to do more," she said against his chest, her voice raw. "I should have had better training, better supplies, something." "You did everything humanly possible," Kenneth said fiercely. "Those men would have all died without you. You gave them a chance. You gave their families time to say goodbye. That matters, Olivia. That matters more than you know." "It does not feel like enough," she whispered. "It never does," Kenneth said. "But it is all we can do. Show up, do our best, and hope it makes a difference." They rode back to Colfax together when the crisis was past, Olivia riding in front of Kenneth on his horse because she was too exhausted to manage her own. She fell asleep against his chest, trusting him completely to get her home safely, and Kenneth felt something settle into place in his heart. This was what he wanted, he realized. Not just the romance and the courtship, but the partnership, the trust, the knowledge that they could face terrible things together and come through on the other side. When they reached town, he carried her up to her room, and she woke just enough to cling to him and murmur, "Stay, please. I do not want to be alone tonight." Kenneth hesitated, knowing what the gossips would say if he was seen leaving her room in the morning, but Olivia's eyes were so full of exhaustion and need that he could not refuse. "I will stay," he promised. "Let me help you get settled and I will sleep in the chair." "The bed is big enough for both of us if we are careful," Olivia said. "I trust you, Kenneth. I just need to know someone is here." So Kenneth removed his boots and his vest and lay down beside her on top of the quilt, and Olivia curled against him with her head on his shoulder and her hand over his heart. And they slept that way until dawn, chaste but intimate, a preview of a future Kenneth desperately wanted and hardly dared to imagine. The gossip, of course, was immediate and enthusiastic. Mrs. Henderson, Olivia's landlady, had seen Kenneth enter the previous evening and not leave, and by noon the next day half the town was speculating about what that meant. Some of the talk was kind, expressing pleasure that the hard-working midwife had found someone. Some of it was less charitable, making assumptions about virtue and respectability that made Kenneth's jaw clench when he overheard snippets at the general store. Olivia faced it with her chin up and her shoulders back, refusing to show embarrassment or offer explanations. Kenneth had been a perfect gentleman, and she had needed comfort after a traumatic few days, and anyone who wanted to think otherwise could keep their opinions to themselves. But she could see the way some of her patients' families began to look at her with doubt, and she worried that the scandal, minor though it was, might damage her reputation enough to affect her work. Kenneth worried about the same thing. He sought out Olivia 2 days after the logging camp incident and found her in her room, mending a tear in one of her work dresses with quick, efficient stitches. "Olivia, I need to talk to you about something," he said without preamble. "About us." She set down her sewing, her expression carefully neutral. "All right. People are talking," Kenneth said bluntly. "About me staying here the other night. I do not care what they say about me, but I care very much if it hurts you or your work. If you need me to step back to stop courting you until the gossip dies down, I will do that. I do not want to, but I will if it is what you need." Olivia stood and crossed to where he was standing near the door, her dark eyes serious. "Kenneth, do you care for me?" "Yes," he said immediately. "More than I know how to express." "Then I do not want you to step back," Olivia said. "I want exactly the opposite. I want you to step forward." Kenneth's heart began to pound. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I am tired of gossip and speculation," Olivia said. "I am tired of being alone. I care for you too, Kenneth, deeply. And if you feel the same, then perhaps we should give the gossips something real to talk about." "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" Kenneth asked carefully. "I am saying that I would very much like to be your wife," Olivia said, her voice steady despite the color rising in her cheeks. "If that is something you want as well. I know this is not how courtships usually progress. I know women are supposed to wait for men to propose. But I have never been very good at doing what I am supposed to do, and I do not want to waste time with uncertainty when I am already certain about you." Kenneth stared at her for a long moment, his mind racing to catch up with what was happening. Then he started to laugh, a sound of pure joy that filled the small room. "Olivia Jensen, you are the most remarkable woman I have ever met, and yes, I want to marry you. I have been trying to figure out how to ask you for weeks, but I kept thinking I needed to have more to offer first. More money, a better position, something worthy of you." "You are worthy of me," Olivia said fiercely. "You are good and kind and brave, and you see me as a person rather than just a useful skill. That is worth more than any amount of money or status. So yes, Kenneth Yates. I want to marry you, and I want it soon enough that people understand you are an honorable man who would never compromise my virtue, but not so soon that it feels rushed or forced. What do you think?" "I think you have just made me the happiest man in California," Kenneth said. He closed the distance between them and kissed her, properly this time. Not the careful, chaste kisses they had shared before, but a real kiss that communicated everything he had been holding back. Olivia kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands coming up to frame his face, and for a long moment the world narrowed to just the two of them, alone in a small room in a rough town, choosing each other against all odds. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kenneth rested his forehead against hers and said, "I do not have a ring. I do not have much of anything, honestly, except a job and some savings and a heart that is entirely yours." "That is more than enough," Olivia assured him. "We will figure out the rest together." They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church, with Marcus standing up as Kenneth's best man and Martha Patterson serving as Olivia's witness. The town turned out in surprising numbers, apparently deciding that a wedding was much more interesting than a scandal. And even Tom Gardner showed up at the back of the church, sober and clean-shaven, and nodded awkwardly at Olivia in what might have been an apology. Olivia wore a simple blue dress that she had owned for years, and Kenneth wore his best shirt and a new vest he had purchased specifically for the occasion. And when they spoke their vows, Kenneth's voice was steady and sure. "I promise to honor you and support you and stand beside you in all things, to be your partner and your friend, to build a life with you that has space for both our dreams." Olivia's vows were equally heartfelt. "I promise to trust you and respect you and choose you every day, to share my burdens and my joys, to build a life with you that is honest and full and good." They sealed it with a kiss that made several of the older women fan themselves, and then they walked out of the church into the bright August sunlight as husband and wife. And Kenneth felt like his heart might burst from the sheer, impossible wonder of it all. The wedding breakfast was held at the saloon, Sullivan having offered the space free of charge because he liked Olivia and thought Kenneth was a solid fellow, and the whole town contributed food and well wishes. Clara and John brought an enormous cake that Clara had stayed up half the night baking. The Chinese families from the laundry district brought dumplings and sweet rice. Even Mrs. Henderson, who had started all the gossip in the first place, contributed a pot roast and grudgingly admitted that perhaps she had been too quick to judge. Kenneth and Olivia accepted it all with grace and genuine gratitude, and when Marcus stood up to give a toast, he kept it short and sincere. To Kenneth and Olivia, who proved that the best partnerships are built on respect and kindness and showing up when it matters. May you have many years together and more happiness than you know what to do with. Everyone drank to that, and the party continued well into the afternoon, full of music and laughter and the particular warmth that comes from community celebration. Kenneth danced with his wife, still marveling at the word, and Olivia laughed in his arms, more carefree than he had ever seen her. As the sun began to set, they slipped away from the celebration and walked back to Olivia's room, which was now their room, at least temporarily. Kenneth had already made arrangements to rent a small house on the edge of town, a place with 2 rooms and a real kitchen and enough space for Olivia to see patients properly, but it would not be ready for another week. "Are you happy?" Kenneth asked as they climbed the stairs, his hand warm in hers. "Deliriously," Olivia said. "Are you?" "More than I ever imagined possible," Kenneth replied honestly. They entered the room and he closed the door behind them, suddenly aware that everything was different now. They were married. This was their wedding night. He had been with women before, brief encounters that had been about physical need more than emotional connection, but this felt entirely new, charged with an intimacy that went beyond the merely physical. Olivia seemed to sense his sudden nervousness because she stepped close and took his hands. "Kenneth, we do not have to do anything tonight. I know we are both exhausted, and if you would rather just sleep, that is perfectly fine with me. I want to, Kenneth said quickly. I want you. I just want it to be good for you, and I am not sure I know how to make that happen. Olivia's expression softened. We will figure it out together. That is what marriage is, I think. Two people learning how to fit together in all the ways that matter. So they did figure it out, with patience and tenderness and occasional laughter when things did not work quite as expected. And when they finally fell asleep, tangled together in the narrow bed, Kenneth thought that he had never felt more complete, more perfectly where he was meant to be. The next months were an exercise in building a life together, while navigating the practical realities of their different work schedules. They moved into the small house Kenneth had rented, and Olivia immediately set up one room as a combination office and supply storage, organizing her instruments and medicines with the precision of someone who needed to be able to find things quickly at any hour. Kenneth continued his ranch work, but started taking on more odd jobs in town, building his reputation as someone reliable who could fix almost anything and never overcharged. Money was tight but not desperate, especially since Olivia's mysterious benefactor continued to pay down her store account whenever it crept too high. She had stopped questioning it, deciding to simply be grateful, though she told Kenneth repeatedly that she wished she knew who to thank properly. Kenneth, who had just paid down $32 the previous week, bit his tongue and said nothing. He had decided that he would tell her eventually, but not until they were more financially stable. He did not want her to feel guilty or worry about his savings when she was already juggling so much. The truth was that Olivia's refusal to charge poor families was not diminishing, and Kenneth loved her for it, even as he worried about the long-term sustainability. She would come home from a difficult delivery, exhausted and splattered with blood, and when Kenneth asked if the family had paid, she would wave off the question with a distracted gesture. They had nothing, Kenneth. The father is injured and cannot work. The mother was eating maybe one meal a day so the children would not starve. How could I ask them for money in that situation? You could not, Kenneth would agree, pulling her close and helping her wash up before they ate dinner. I just worry about you wearing yourself down to nothing. I am fine, Olivia would insist, though increasingly Kenneth could see the weariness in her eyes, the way her hands shook slightly after particularly difficult cases. She was carrying too much, he thought, but he did not know how to help beyond continuing to quietly pay her bills and making sure she ate regularly and slept when she could. In November, winter arrived early with a storm that dumped 3 feet of snow on Colfax in a single night, and the temperature plummeted. The snow brought a rash of medical emergencies, frostbite and broken bones from falls on ice and pneumonia in children and elderly people, whose homes were not adequately heated. Olivia was constantly in motion, trudging through snow that sometimes reached her thighs to reach patients who could not come to her. Kenneth accompanied her whenever he could, breaking trail and carrying her bag, and sometimes carrying patients themselves when moving them was necessary. He saw things during those weeks that stayed with him. The gratitude in people's eyes when Olivia saved a child's frostbitten toes. The grief when she could not save an elderly man whose lungs had filled with fluid. He saw his wife work miracles with inadequate supplies and sheer determination, and he fell in love with her all over again, deeper and more permanent than before. It was during one of these calls, a difficult breech berth in a cabin 5 miles from town, that Kenneth finally understood the full extent of what Olivia's generosity was costing them. The family, recently arrived from Missouri and clearly struggling, had 4 other children already, all under the age of 7. The cabin was barely weatherproof, The father was sick with what looked like the early stages of consumption, and the mother had been in labor for nearly 20 hours when they finally sent for Olivia. Kenneth and Olivia made the journey on horseback through snow that was still falling, and when they arrived at the cabin, Kenneth could see immediately that this would not be easy. The mother, whose name was Ruth, was exhausted and feverish, and the baby was positioned wrong. Olivia worked for 6 hours, her hands steady and her voice calm even when Kenneth could see the worry in her eyes. She finally managed to turn the baby and deliver it safely, a little girl who came out screaming with impressive lung power, and Ruth wept with relief and exhaustion. When it was over and both mother and baby were stable, the father, a thin man named James who could not stop coughing, approached Olivia with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. "We do not have any money right now, but come spring I will find work and I promise I will pay you then." Olivia smiled at him, gentle and understanding. "Do not worry about payment. Just focus on taking care of your family and getting well yourself. That cough concerns me. You should see a doctor when you can." They left the cabin as dawn was breaking, and Kenneth held Olivia as she rode in front of him, her body limp with exhaustion against his chest. "That man is dying," she said quietly. "The consumption is advanced. He will be lucky to see summer." "I know," Kenneth said. "That family is going to be destitute when he dies," Olivia continued. "Ruth will have 5 children to feed and no husband to provide. They will end up in an orphanage or worse." "Probably," Kenneth agreed, though the thought made his stomach twist. "How is anyone supposed to charge money in a situation like that?" Olivia asked, and her voice cracked. "How am I supposed to demand payment from people who have nothing?" "You are not," Kenneth said firmly. "You are supposed to do exactly what you did, which is save lives and show compassion and trust that things will somehow work out." "But they do not always work out," Olivia said. "Sometimes people just suffer and struggle and die, and being kind does not change that." "No," Kenneth said. "But it makes the suffering more bearable. That matters, Olivia. Your kindness matters." When they got home, Kenneth helped Olivia wash and dress in clean clothes, then tucked her into bed and sat beside her until she fell asleep. Then he went to the general store, where Martha Patterson was just opening up, and paid down Olivia's entire account, $73 that represented most of what remained of his savings. Martha stared at the money, then at Kenneth. "You know she is going to keep running up charges," she said gently. "I admire what you are doing, Mr. Yates, truly I do, but you cannot afford to keep doing this forever." "I know," Kenneth said, "but I can afford to do it today, and that is enough." It was the beginning of December, and Christmas was approaching, and Kenneth made a decision. He went to see Clara and John, who now lived in a small farmhouse outside of town, and found his sister in her kitchen kneading bread while young Thomas played on the floor with a set of wooden blocks. "Kenneth," Clara exclaimed, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron and coming to embrace him. "What a wonderful surprise! Where is Olivia?" "Sleeping," Kenneth said. "She had a difficult call last night. Clara, I need to talk to you and John about something." Clara's expression turned serious. She called for John, who came in from the barn where he had been repairing a broken stall door, and the 3 of them sat down at the kitchen table while Thomas continued his architectural experiments on the floor. Kenneth explained the situation as plainly as he could: Olivia's inability to charge poor families, the mounting bills, his secret payments, his dwindling savings. "I am not asking for a loan," he said firmly. "I know you have your own expenses. But I was wondering if you might know of any work I could take on in addition to the ranch. Something that pays better or offers more hours. I need to find a way to keep us afloat." Clara and John exchanged glances, one of those wordless communications that long married couples develop, and then John leaned forward. "Kenneth, I might have an idea. You know that parcel of land that borders our property to the north? The one that has been sitting vacant since old man Hutchins died?" Kenneth nodded. It was about 40 acres of decent grazing land with a small creek running through it, exactly the kind of property he had once dreamed of owning. "The bank is selling it for back taxes," John continued. "They have been asking $150, which is absurdly low, but nobody in the area has that kind of cash right now. What if we bought it together? Clara and I could put up half, and you could contribute what you are able. We would own it jointly, run some cattle on it, split the profits. It would not be immediate income, but within a year or two it could provide steady money for both our families." Kenneth stared at his brother-in-law, hope and disbelief warring in his chest. "John, I cannot let you do that. I barely have $30 left to my name. So contribute $30 now and the rest as you are able," Clara said. "Kenneth, you saved my life and Thomas's life. You have been paying Olivia's bills in secret for months, ruining your own financial security so she can keep helping people. Let us help you for once. Besides," John added, "it is a solid investment. That land is good and cattle prices are rising. This is not charity, it is partnership. Think about it. A year from now, you and Olivia could have steady income from the cattle operation, enough that she would not have to worry so much about which families can pay. You could build your own house on the property eventually, have the space and security you both deserve." Kenneth felt emotion tighten his throat. "I do not know what to say." "Say yes," Clara said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "Say you will let your family help you build the future you want." So Kenneth said yes, and 2 weeks later the four of them stood on the property that now belonged jointly to the Yates-Brennan partnership, watching the winter sun set behind the mountains and planning for a future that suddenly seemed possible. Kenneth had not told Olivia yet, wanting to wait until everything was finalized, but he could imagine her face when he explained what this meant. Security. Options. The ability to be generous without slowly destroying themselves financially. Christmas that year was simple but sweet. Kenneth gave Olivia a new medical bag, sturdy leather with brass fittings and enough compartments to organize all her supplies properly. Olivia gave Kenneth a watch that had belonged to her father, silver and engraved with his initials. "I want you to have this," she said as he opened it with trembling hands. "My father would have liked you. He believed in hard work and integrity and taking care of people who could not take care of themselves. You embody all of those things." Kenneth kissed her, tasting salt tears though he could not say whether they were his or hers, and thought that he had never received a more meaningful gift. On Christmas night, after they had eaten dinner and exchanged presents, and made love with the particular tenderness that came from deep, emotional connection, Kenneth told Olivia about the land partnership. He explained everything, the depleted savings, the secret bill payments, the deal with Clara and John, and the future they could now build together. Olivia listened in silence, her expression moving through shock and understanding, and finally landing on something that looked like awe. "You have been paying my store account," she said when he finished. "All this time, the anonymous benefactor was you." "Yes," Kenneth admitted. "I am sorry I did not tell you sooner. I did not want you to feel guilty or obligated." "Guilty," Olivia repeated. "Kenneth, I feel grateful and humbled. And slightly angry that you spent your savings on me when you were working toward buying your own land." "Our land," Kenneth corrected. "Everything I do is for us now, Olivia. Your dreams are my dreams. Your work matters to me because it matters to you. I do not regret a single dollar I spent keeping you able to do what you do best." Olivia pressed her face against his chest, her arms coming around him tightly. "I love you," she said, muffled against his shirt. "I love you so much it terrifies me sometimes." "I love you too," Kenneth said. "And now we have land and a plan and a future. It is going to be hard work, but we can do it together." And so they did. The winter passed slowly, as winters in the Sierra foothills do, with periods of bitter cold interspersed with milder days when the sun felt almost warm. Kenneth spent his time between ranch work and preparing the new land, repairing fences and clearing brush, and planning where to build a small barn for the cattle they would purchase come spring. Olivia continued her work, but with the knowledge of Kenneth's support and the promise of future financial stability, some of the desperate edge had left her exhaustion. In February, she realized she was pregnant. She knew the signs intimately, having seen them in hundreds of other women, but somehow she had missed them in herself. Too busy and too tired to notice that her courses had not come in 2 months. When she finally accepted the truth, she felt a complicated tangle of emotions. Joy, certainly, and fear, both for the risks of childbirth which she understood better than most, and for what a baby would mean for her work. How could she answer calls at all hours of the night when she had an infant to care for? She told Kenneth that evening, watching his face carefully for his reaction. "I am pregnant," she said without preamble. "About 2 months along, I think. The baby should come in September." Kenneth's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, delight, concern, and finally landing on a smile so wide and genuine that Olivia felt her own worries ease slightly. "A baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "Olivia, that is wonderful, is it?" she asked. "Kenneth, I do not know how to do this, how to be a mother and still be a midwife, how to balance what I want to do with what I need to do." Kenneth crossed to where she was standing by the window and pulled her into his arms. "We will figure it out," he said firmly. "Just like we figure everything else out, together. Maybe you cannot answer every call once the baby comes, but you can still see patients here. You can train someone else to help with the more distant calls. You can adapt. We both can." "You make it sound so simple," Olivia said. "It is not simple," Kenneth acknowledged, "but it is possible. And Olivia, you are going to be an amazing mother. You are patient and knowledgeable, and you care so deeply about people. Our child is lucky to have you." Olivia let herself believe him, and over the following months, as her body changed and the baby grew, she began to envision a future that included both her work and motherhood. She talked to some of the other women in town about how they managed, and she started training a young woman named Alice, who had expressed interest in midwifery, teaching her basic skills that would allow her to handle simpler cases. Kenneth was attentive and careful during her pregnancy, insisting she rest more and take on fewer distant calls. He accompanied her whenever possible, and when her ankles swelled in the summer heat, he would massage them in the evenings with gentle hands that made her feel treasured. The cattle operation was thriving beyond their expectations. They had purchased 10 head in April, and the animals had fattened well on the spring grass. John handled most of the day-to-day care since Kenneth still worked at the ranch, but Kenneth spent his free days on the property, and already they were talking about building a small house there within the next 2 years. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the particular golden light that comes to California in early autumn, and Olivia's labor began on a clear morning when the air smelled of pine and distant wood smoke. Kenneth rode to fetch Clara, who had agreed to attend the birth, and then settled in to wait, his hands clenched together and his jaw tight with worry. Olivia labored for 9 hours, which she kept insisting was quite reasonable for a first baby, though Kenneth thought every one of those hours might kill him from sheer anxiety. He held her hand and brought her water and tried not to let his fear show, because she needed him to be steady. When the baby finally came, a boy with a powerful set of lungs and a full head of dark hair, Kenneth wept openly. Clara placed the baby in Olivia's arms, and Kenneth knelt beside the bed and looked at his wife and son with a sense of awe so profound, it felt religious. "He is perfect," Kenneth managed to say through the tightness in his throat. "He is ours," Olivia replied, smiling through her own tears. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months without settling on anything, but looking at his son's small, perfect face, Kenneth knew immediately. "James," he said, "after your father." Olivia's eyes widened, more tears spilling over. "Are you certain? I thought you might want to name him after your father." "My father was not a good man," Kenneth said quietly. "Your father was. I want our son to carry the name of someone who represented the best of what a man can be." "James Yates," Olivia said, testing the sound of it. "Yes, I think that is exactly right." Little James was a healthy baby, demanding and loud and beloved beyond measure. Olivia discovered that she could, in fact, balance motherhood and her work, though it required help from people she had not expected. The Chinese families she had helped over the years took turns watching James when Olivia had to make a call. Martha Patterson would mind him for a few hours at the general store, cooing over him between customers. Even Kenneth's employer at the ranch offered to let him bring the baby to work on days when Olivia was particularly busy. And Kenneth spent several memorable afternoons doing fence repairs, with James sleeping in a sling against his chest. By the time James was 6 months old, in March of 1884, the cattle operation had grown to 20 head and was generating enough profit that Kenneth was able to quit the ranch work and focus entirely on their own land. They began building a house that spring, a real house with 3 bedrooms and a proper kitchen, and a room where Olivia could see patients. Kenneth did much of the work himself, with help from John and some of the other men in town who owed Olivia favors for medical care. And by summer, the house was finished enough to move into. The day they carried their belongings into the new house felt like a culmination of everything they had worked toward. Olivia walked through the rooms with James on her hip, touching the walls Kenneth had built and looking out the windows at the land that was theirs, and felt a contentment so deep it almost frightened her. "Happy?" Kenneth asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around both her and James. "More than I ever imagined possible," Olivia said honestly. "Kenneth, we have built something real here, something that will last." "We have," Kenneth agreed, "and we are not finished. This is just the beginning." He was right. Over the next few years, their lives continued to grow and deepen. Olivia maintained her practice, but with more balance, able to choose which calls to take and training Alice to handle many of the routine deliveries. She never lost her compassion for families who could not pay, but with the income from the cattle operation providing security, the unpaid work no longer threatened their survival. Kenneth's reputation as a fair and skilled rancher grew, and other small operators began coming to him for advice. He started a loose cooperative with several neighboring ranches, sharing resources and labor during busy seasons, and the cooperative became known for treating workers fairly and paying promptly. James grew into a sturdy, cheerful boy who loved animals, and showed early signs of his mother's quick intelligence and his father's steady temperament. When he was 3, Olivia gave birth to a daughter they named Clara, after Kenneth's sister, and 2 years after that, a second daughter they named Rose, after Olivia's mother whose given name had been Rosemary. The house echoed with the sounds of children, and Kenneth would sometimes pause in his work to listen to James explaining something to his younger sisters with exaggerated patience, or Olivia singing while she cooked dinner, and marvel at the sheer impossible fortune of his life. By 1889, 7 years after their marriage, Kenneth and Olivia Yates were established members of the Colfax community. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, with land that had increased in value and a cattle operation that provided steady income. Olivia still practiced midwifery, though on a reduced schedule that allowed her to prioritize her own family. Alice had developed into a skilled practitioner in her own right and handled many of the cases that once would have fallen entirely to Olivia. Kenneth, now 35, had achieved the dream he had once thought impossible. He owned land, ran cattle, had a wife he adored, and 3 healthy children. The boy who had grown up poor and hungry with a father who saw the world through the bottom of a whiskey bottle had built something solid and good. One evening in late summer, with the children finally asleep after an energetic day, Kenneth and Olivia sat on the porch of their house and watched the sun set behind the mountains. These quiet moments had become precious, stolen time when they could simply be together without the demands of work or children. "You remember the day we met?" Olivia asked, leaning her head against Kenneth's shoulder. "When I nearly ran into you on the street." "I remember," Kenneth said. "I thought you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen and completely out of my reach." "I remember thinking you had kind eyes," Olivia said. "But I never imagined we would end up here, that you would become the center of my entire world." Kenneth kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. "I paid your store account for months before I ever had the courage to speak to you properly," he admitted. "I would have kept doing it anonymously forever if Tom Gardner had not forced my hand that day in the saloon." Olivia laughed softly. "I am glad he did then. As terrifying as it was in the moment, it brought us together." "Everything brought us together," Kenneth said. "All of it, the struggles and the hard work and the choices we made. It all led here." "To this," Olivia agreed, gesturing at the house, the land, the life they had built. "Kenneth, I want you to know that I see what you sacrificed for me, for us. The money you spent when you had so little, the dreams you deferred, the way you supported my work even when it cost us. I see it, and I am grateful every single day." "It was not sacrifice," Kenneth said. "It was investment, in you, in us, in the future we could build together. And look at what we have now, Olivia. Look at what we made." They sat together as the light faded and the first stars appeared, and Kenneth thought about the long road that had brought them here. From that first moment on a muddy street, through courtship and marriage and all the challenges that had tested them, they had chosen each other again and again. That, he thought, was what love really meant. Not the easy moments of passion and romance, though those mattered too, but the steady, deliberate choice to keep showing up, keep working, keep believing that together they could build something worth having. The years continued to roll forward, as years do, bringing both joy and sorrow. Kenneth's sister Clara died from pneumonia in the winter of 1892, leaving John devastated and young Thomas, now 12, suddenly without a mother. Kenneth and Olivia took him in without hesitation, raising him alongside their own children, and Thomas flourished under their care, eventually taking over much of the cattle operation as he grew into a capable young man. Olivia delivered her last baby as a practicing midwife in 1895, a healthy girl born to a family of Swedish immigrants who had recently arrived in the area. She was 47 years old, and her hands, while still steady, ached on cold mornings in a way that reminded her she was no longer young. Alice had fully taken over the practice by then, with Olivia serving more as an advisor and teacher than an active practitioner, and Olivia found she did not miss the exhausting late-night calls as much as she had expected. She had given decades of her life to caring for others, and now, It was time to focus on her own family and the community work that fulfilled her in different ways. Kenneth's hair had gone silver at the temples, and the years of hard physical labor had left him with a slight stiffness in his back on cold mornings. But he was healthy and strong and still rose every morning with a sense of purpose. The cattle operation had expanded to nearly 100 head, making them one of the more successful small ranchers in the area, and Kenneth took quiet pride in knowing that he had built this with his own hands and determination. Their children grew. James studied veterinary medicine and returned to Colfax to establish a practice, becoming the first official veterinarian in the area. Clara married a teacher from Sacramento and moved to the city, though she visited often and wrote long letters that Olivia treasured. Rose, who had inherited her mother's passion for medicine, went to nursing school in San Francisco and eventually returned to work at the small hospital that had been established in Colfax in the late 1890s. By 1902, Kenneth and Olivia were grandparents 3 times over, with more grandchildren arriving regularly. They had lived through the closing of the frontier, the rise of new technologies like telephones and automobiles, and the transition of Colfax from a rough railroad town to a more established community. The world had changed around them, but some things remained constant. Their love for each other, built on mutual respect and shared values, had only deepened with time. The land they had purchased together all those years ago now supported not just their family, but also provided employment for several local men and their families. The legacy of Olivia's medical work lived on through the practitioners she had trained, and the countless lives she had saved or improved. One evening in October of 1906, with autumn painting the mountains in shades of gold and rust, Kenneth and Olivia celebrated their 24th wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner at home. Their children and grandchildren had visited earlier in the day, filling the house with noise and laughter, but now it was just the two of them, sharing a meal in comfortable silence. "I have been thinking," Olivia said as they finished eating, "about how different my life would have been if you had not walked into that saloon 24 years ago, if you had not stood up to Tom Gardner and then offered to walk me home." "I have been thinking about that too," Kenneth admitted. "Though I suspect we would have found our way to each other eventually. Some things feel inevitable in retrospect." "Maybe," Olivia said, "but I am glad it happened the way it did. I am glad you were brave enough to speak to me and stubborn enough to keep courting me even when you thought you had nothing to offer." "I did have nothing to offer," Kenneth pointed out. "You had yourself," Olivia said, "your integrity and your kindness and your strength." "That was everything, Kenneth. That was more than enough." Kenneth reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar pattern of veins and bones, the hands that had delivered hundreds of babies and soothed countless fevered brows and held his own children with infinite tenderness. "I love you," he said simply. "I've loved you since that day on the street when you almost ran into me, and I will love you until the day I die and probably beyond that." "I love you too," Olivia replied, her eyes bright with tears that were purely happy. "Everything good in my life, everything meaningful has been built on the foundation of us, our partnership, our love, our choice to keep choosing each other." They sat together as the candles burned low, two people who had started with nothing but determination and love and built a life that mattered. The midwife who refused payment from poor families, and the cowboy who secretly paid her bills, had become something more than themselves, a partnership that had rippled outward to touch countless other lives, to build institutions and train successors, and create a legacy of compassion and integrity. Outside, The October wind rustled through the trees on the land they owned, land that would pass to their children and grandchildren. A tangible reminder that love and hard work could create something lasting. Inside, Kenneth and Olivia sat together in the house they had built with their own hands, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived, and knew themselves to be deeply, completely blessed. The years rolled on, as years always do, but the foundation they had built held strong. Their love story, which had begun on a muddy street in a rough railroad town, became a quiet legend in Colfax, the kind of story people told their children as an example of what real love looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but steady, daily choices to support and care for each other. The willingness to sacrifice without counting the cost. The courage to build a life together even when the odds seemed impossible. Kenneth and Olivia Yates lived to see the 20th century well established, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and the knowledge that they had done something rare and valuable. They had found each other in an unlikely place and an unlikely time, and they had chosen to create beauty and meaning from the raw materials of love and determination. It was, they both agreed in their later years, more than enough. It was everything. And when Kenneth died peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1914 at the age of 60, with Olivia holding his hand and their children gathered around them, his last words were of gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered to his wife of 32 years, "for every day, for all of it." Olivia lived another 5 years, long enough to meet great-grandchildren and see James take over the full operation of the ranch, and watch Rose become the head nurse at Colfax General Hospital. She died in 1919, on a morning when the spring flowers were blooming and the sun was warm on her face, and her last conscious thought was of Kenneth waiting for her, patient as always, ready to walk beside her into whatever came next. Their descendants still live on the land they purchased with such hope and faith, still run cattle on the same hills, still tell the story of how it all began with secret payments and quiet kindness, and the courage to believe that love could be enough. And in the end, of course, it was.